Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources, dive in head first, and pull out the absolutely essential information you need to feel truly well-informed. We sift through the details, find the most surprising facts, and give you just enough perspective and maybe a little humor to make it stick.
And today, we're doing a deep dive into a document that, well, it was penned over 130 years ago, but it speaks with, I think, startling clarity to these enduring questions about work, wealth, and society. We're talking about Pope Leo XIII, 1891 Encyclical Rerum Novarum.
Right. You send us excerpts from a translation of this foundational text, specifically the part subtitled On the Condition of Laborers. And it was written during, a period of intense social and economic change globally.
Absolutely.
So our mission today is to essentially summarize this document for you by unpacking its core message. And we want to understand the turbulent world that prompted the Pope to write it in the first place.
What he saw as the critical problems facing working people back then.
Exactly. And the solutions he considered and rejected, the one he actually proposed instead.
And why he felt certain rights needed defending while specific duties needed emphasizing for everyone involved.
Yeah, we're going to go through its arguments pretty much point by point, following the structure you've given us to see what crucial insights and maybe enduring wisdom it holds for you.
You know, Rerum Novarum isn't just some historical footnote. It really is the cornerstone of modern Catholic social teaching. It continues to influence discussions about economics, labor rights, the role of the state, the church.
Well, understanding it is key.
It's like getting a key, to unlock decades of subsequent thought on these really complex topics.
Okay, so let's unpack the world that Rerum Novarum stepped into. The document opens describing this powerful desire for new things. That's the phrase it uses that had been shaking the world for a while before 1891. It sets a scene of pretty intense upheaval.
Yes, and that Latin phrase, Rerum Novarum, it literally translates to "of new things." So the title itself acknowledges this era of rapid, profound transformation that was unsettling, everything. The Pope immediately gets to the heart of this widespread feeling that the old order was changing dramatically. And, not always for the better, especially for working people.
And the encyclical doesn't just hint at this upheaval. It lists out the specific changes it sees driving this instability. What were they exactly?
Right. The text points to several interconnected developments. First, there were the new industrial developments and techniques. You have to think this is the latter half of the Industrial Revolution, steam power, factories getting bigger, new machinery constantly being invented.
So not just tech change, but it changed how work happened.
It fundamentally altered how things were made and where work happened.
Which obviously changed the relationship between the people running these new industries and the people actually doing the work.
Precisely. The document notes significant changes in the relationship between masters, that's employers, factory owners, and workers, the laborers, the old craft system, with guilds and maybe a more direct personal connection.
Yeah, apprentice, journeyman.
That was largely gone. The new factory system often involved huge numbers of pretty anonymous workers employed by owners who might be quite distant.
And this new structure led to, a dramatic economic stratification, right? The text talks about wealth concentrating heavily at the top.
It paints a stark picture of inequality, On one hand, a small group was becoming very wealthy, accumulating vast amounts of capital, control over the means of production. These were the industrialists, the financiers, the new elite.
While on the other hand,
a vast number of people were suffering in poverty. And this wasn't just a few unfortunate individuals. It was a widespread condition affecting the majority, living in, really precarious circumstances, often in harsh urban environments that had sprung up around these factories.
And the workers themselves were changing too, becoming more aware of their shared situation.
Yes, the document observes that workers were gaining self-confidence and cooperating more closely. This is a clear nod to the rise of organized labor movements, early trade unions, mutual aid societies. Workers were starting to see their collective power as a way to push back
against these difficult conditions.
Exactly.
And amidst all this economic and social ferment, the encyclical also notes a decline in morals.
That's presented as part of the overall sort of spiritual and social instability of the time. The argument is that these rapid material changes weren't happening in a vacuum. They were accompanied by a weakening of traditional moral constraints and religious influence in public life.
So you have this explosive mix. Rapid tech change, shifting social relationships, huge wealth for a few, widespread poverty for many, workers organizing, and this perceived decline in morals.
Hmm.
The document says all this created a struggle ready to break out.
A struggle ready to break out. That's incredibly strong language, isn't it? It conveys a real sense of crisis, of a situation just on the verge of explosion. The document talks about hopeless agitation gripping society. This wasn't some quiet academic problem. It was a burning issue causing deep concern across all levels. The learned, business people, politicians, everyone was feeling the tension.
It felt urgent, and the Pope felt he had to speak.
Precisely. The Encyclical states this issue is most pressing, gripping humanity's attention. And because of that urgency and his duty as head of the Catholic Church, his apostolic office, as he calls it, Pope Leo XIII, felt compelled to address the condition of laborers more fully, more explicitly than maybe had been done before in such a formal way.
He also acknowledges that tackling this is difficult and risky. Why did he say that?
Well, the text explains it's inherently complex to fairly judge the rights and duties between the wealthy owners, the capitalists holding the property, and the propertyless workers supplying the labor. That relationship is just fraught with potential conflict. And it's made worse, the document notes, by constant manipulation, people using force or, cunning to mislead the masses, stir up resentment, and basically complicate the search for just solutions.
So, the Pope isn't just looking at economics. He sees intentional efforts to exploit the situation. For ideological gain, maybe.
Yes, there's definitely an awareness of these external forces actively trying to shape the narrative and push society in a particular direction. But despite the difficulty, despite the manipulation, the document notes there is a general agreement on one thing. The interests of the lowest social strata, the working poor, needed urgent attention because their difficulties were just undeniable.
Let's zero in on that unfortunate state the majority of workers were experiencing. The document paints a really vivid picture of their plight. What were the specific circumstances they faced?
The encyclical describes workers as being buffeted by misfortune, paralyzed by misery, without any fault of their own. And that phrase, without any fault of their own, is crucial.
Yeah, that stands out.
It asserts that their suffering wasn't because they were lazy or morally deficient, but it was a consequence of systemic issues, external circumstances.
What were those circumstances that left them so vulnerable?
The text points back to historical changes. In the previous century, the old workers' guilds, these traditional associations of craftsmen, laborers that provided training, mutual aid, some protection.
A degree of collective power.
Right. They were abolished. And the document notes this happened without any replacement means of protection being put in place.
So they lost their traditional support structure, essentially.
Exactly. And coupled with that, the text mentions that traditional religious life was increasingly removed from government and laws. This suggests a kind of secularization trend where the moral framework, the communal bonds offered by religious institutions, had less influence on public policy and social structures.
And the result of losing that protection in this changing social landscape.
According to the encyclical, workers were left isolated and vulnerable, helpless. They became subject to inhuman treatment by employers' conditions that stripped them of their dignity. And they were easy targets for the unbridled greed of unscrupulous competitors operating in a largely unregulated environment.
The document specifically calls out one form of this exploitation, too.
It does. It highlights how the situation was worsened by rapacious usury, which is basically greedy exploitation, often through subtle means. While the Church had historically condemned overt usury charging excessive interest, the text notes this exploitative spirit was still alive and well, practiced in ways that took advantage of the poor's desperation.
And this power to exploit was concentrated.
Yes, the document states that the management of labor, industry, trade had become concentrated in the hands of a few rich. This allowed this small group to impose conditions on the vast number of workers that the encyclical describes with, frankly, shocking honesty as little better than slavery itself.
Little better than slavery itself. That phrasing just leaps out. It's incredibly powerful language for a papal document from 1891. It really underscores how dire the situation for workers was seen by the Church.
It leaves no room for ambiguity at all. It's a direct, forceful condemnation of the exploitative conditions faced by industrial laborers at the time, framing it as a grave injustice.
So Section 1 really sets this urgent stage. A world in rapid transition, marked by massive inequality, unprotected workers facing brutal conditions, and this palpable sense of impending conflict, all of which compelled the Pope to speak out and offer the Church's perspective.
It absolutely establishes the crisis context that the entire document is responding to.
Which leads us immediately into Section 2, where the document addresses a major proposed solution of the day: socialism.
Yeah.
The encyclical doesn't shy away from confronting it directly.
Not at all. I mean, Rerum Novarum was written at a time when socialist ideas were gaining significant traction among workers, among intellectuals, as the primary alternative to the existing capitalist system. So the Pope clearly felt it necessary to address these ideas head on.
How did the socialists propose to fix the problem, according to the way the encyclical describes their ideas?
Well, the text presents their proposal as one that aimed to fix the suffering of the poor by inciting them to envy the rich
Okay.
and advocating for the abolition of private property.
Abolishing private property entirely.
Yes, that's how it's presented in the document. The core idea was that individual private property should be taken away and made common, managed collectively.
And who would manage this common property?
The text states it would be managed either by local officials or the state. The belief, as the encyclical portrays it, was that this transfer of ownership from private individuals to common or state control would sort of magically solve the problems of inequality and poverty and lead to a fair distribution of capital and income for everyone.
So what does this all mean? How does Pope Leo XIII respond to this socialist vision?
His response is immediate, it's forceful, and it leaves absolutely no doubt where the church stands. He argues that this socialist approach is wholly unfitted to solve the problems of the laborers.
Not just unfitted, but harmful.
More than that, yes. He argues it would actually harm the working class, the very people it claims to help. And he concludes definitively it is emphatically unjust.
Emphatically unjust. Strong words again. Why does the encyclical see it as both unjust and harmful?
The text lays out a few key reasons. First, it's unjust because it violates the lawful possessors, those who currently own property justly. Taking it away by force is seen as a violation of their rights.
Oh.
Second, it argues this approach would pervert the office of the state, suggesting the state's proper role isn't to own and manage all property, but something else entirely. We'll dig into the state's proper role later, but this is an early signal that the Pope sees definite limits on state power.
And thirdly,
the document warns that abolishing private property would create utter confusion in the community. This suggests a breakdown of social order, of the fundamental structure society is built on.
let's dig into that argument about how it would actually harm the worker. That seems like a crucial and maybe surprising point from the encyclical, given that socialism claimed to champion the worker.
It is a key insight the document really emphasizes. The text explains it this way. A person works for pay primarily to acquire something that is his own.
Right, something tangible.
He uses his labor, his skill, not just for the sake of working, but to gain the means necessary to meet his human needs, both present and future. By working for wages, the document argues, a laborer earns a full and perfect right to use that wage as he sees fit.
And if he chooses to save that wage.
Yeah.
Or invest it.
Exactly. The text says if a worker is frugal, limits his spending, and uses his savings to buy property, maybe a small plot of land, a house, other goods, that property is simply his wage in another form. It's the accumulated fruit of his labor and his prudence.
So the core insight here is that Pope Leo isn't just defending the rich or some abstract principle of property. He's arguing that abolishing private property harms the worker most directly by denying them the freedom to use their earned income to build lasting assets and security.
That is precisely the argument. The document states that by attempting to transfer private property to common ownership, socialists worsen the condition of all workmen. They deny the worker the liberty to use his own earned wages as he chooses, including that fundamental right to acquire and hold property.
And it robs them of hope.
And, perhaps even more significantly, the text adds, this robs the worker of the hope and opportunity to increase his own wealth, to improve his material circumstances over time, and to provide for his future and his family's future through his own effort and savings.
So the encyclical sees the prospect of acquiring property through one's own labor as a fundamental incentive and a path to security for the working class, arguing that socialism removes that path.
Yes, it's framed not just as an injustice against current owners, but as a direct attack on the potential for upward mobility and security for the working person. It undermines the very goal of improving their condition. It firmly rejects socialism as a viable solution.
Okay, having rejected the socialist approach, the document then pivots to defending private property, arguing it's not just a legal convention, but a natural human right. This is where it gets a bit more philosophical.
Indeed. The encyclical doesn't just say private property is good or useful. It attempts to ground it in the fundamental nature of being human, drawing heavily on classical philosophy, particularly thinkers like Thomas Aquinas.
How does it build this argument? It starts by contrasting humans and animals.
Yes, it uses this contrast to highlight what makes humans unique. Animals, it says, are governed solely by natural instinct. Their actions are driven by immediate needs, preservation, procreation. They use only what's available right now and are guided only by senses and perception. They can't really plan for the distant future.
But human nature is fundamentally different.
Far different, the document argues. While we have animal capacities, our nature is far above animal nature because it's not limited by instinct or immediate sensation.
And the key distinguishing factor is reason.
Exactly. Humans possess reason, this capacity denied to animals. And because humans are the only rational creatures on Earth, the document argues, they have a right not just to use things temporarily, like animals do, eating grass, finding momentary shelter, but to have and possess them in stable and permanent possession.
And this applies especially to things that last.
Yes, not just things immediately consumed like food, but things useful over longer periods that require investment or cultivation like land or durable goods, tools, housing.
This sounds like the argument is built on our capacity for foresight and planning.
That's precisely it. The document elaborates on this need for permanence. Human reason lets us connect the present with the future. We're not stuck in the moment. Because we can govern ourselves through reason and free will, we can plan for future needs. Always, the text notes, under God's eternal law. This means we can choose actions beneficial for the future, not just satisfying an immediate urge.
And how does that foresight lead specifically to the necessity of owning land?
Well, the text argues that because future needs constantly recur, you need food today, you'll need it next year, your family will need it long after you're gone. Nature itself must have provided a stable, permanent source for these recurring needs.
And land is that source.
The Encyclical concludes that only land and its inherent fertility can provide this kind of permanence and ongoing supply. Therefore, it's justly and naturally right for a human being to possess not just the immediate fruits of the earth, the crops harvested today, but the earth itself, the source of those future fruits.
And this right to property is seen as existing even before the state. Fundamentally.
Yes, the document makes a point that the origin of the state doesn't create this right. Humans, it argues, are older than the state. Before any organized government existed, individuals received the right from nature itself to provide for their life and sustenance. This inherent right, flowing from their rational nature, precedes civil society.
Okay, but the text also addresses that common counterargument, that God gave the earth to all humanity in common. So how can individuals claim private ownership?
Right, it tackles that directly. It clarifies this doesn't mean everyone owns it jointly or can just use it however they please without any order or division. The document explains that God didn't assign specific parts to specific individuals directly. Instead, he left the distribution and appropriation of the earth to human industry, meaning human labor, effort, ingenuity, and the institutions of peoples, referring to social customs, legal systems, forms of governance that societies develop over time.
And even when divided, it still serves the common good. How does that work?
Crucially, the text argues that yes, even when the earth is divided into private possessions, it still serves the common needs of humanity. How? Well, the document explains that no one lives entirely without sustenance derived from the land, either directly or indirectly.
Even if they don't own land themselves.
Right. Those who don't own land provide their labor maybe working the land for others, or working in industry, or providing services, and they receive wages or income in exchange. These wages, in turn, allow them to purchase the produce of the land or the goods created through industry, which ultimately come from the earth's resources. So labor, paid by the earth's produce or its equivalents, becomes the means of sustenance for everyone, even within a system of private ownership.
So the conclusion from this part of the philosophical argument is that private ownership is not contrary to nature, but in strict conformity with nature.
That's the fundamental claim. It's seen as a natural consequence of human reason, foresight, and the need for stable provision for the future. And the document adds another strong layer by linking property to the fruit of labor.
How so?
When people apply their reason and their physical labor to natural resources, particularly land, they don't just use it. They transform it, improve it. They leave their unique impress upon it, as the text says.
Like clearing wild land or building something on it.
Exactly. The text argues that because of this application of effort, the part of nature they've worked on becomes justly theirs. It is the product of their energy and skill, and therefore no one may in any way violate this right to the product of one's labor.
And the Encyclical specifically refutes those who might say, well, you only have a right to use the resources, not to own the land itself, even if you worked it hard.
It calls this view wrong. Why? Because, the document argues, labor isn't just a temporary interaction. It changes the land fundamentally, makes it productive, improves its value. The text uses powerful language. The improvements become so truly merged and blended with the land itself as to be inseparable.
So taking it would be unjust.
It's most unjust, the document says, to take the fruit of labor that someone else has sweated over. It uses a straightforward principle. As effect follows cause, the fruit of labor belongs to the laborer.
That's a very direct assertion connecting effort and the right to the outcome.
It firmly anchors the right to property in the labor expended upon it. And the document wraps up this core argument by stating that this view, natural law, private property rooted in labor, is consistent with humanity's general judgment throughout history across cultures. It brings peace and tranquility. It's endorsed by civil law, provided that civil law is just, which is an important caveat.
Right, that civil law should reflect natural law.
Exactly. And significantly, it's confirmed by divine law, specifically citing the Ten Commandments and their prohibition against coveting what belongs to your neighbor, house, fields, servants, livestock, anything that is your neighbor's.
So the defense of private property rests on a combination of philosophy, human nature, reason, labor plus history, just civil law, and divine law.
It's a comprehensive argument designed to present private ownership as a fundamental, deeply rooted right, essential for human flourishing and a stable social order. And this lays the groundwork for the document's specific proposals later on.
The document doesn't stop there with defending property. It strengthens the argument even further by linking it intrinsically to the family unit.
Yes, this is a crucial connection in Catholic social thought. The family is seen as the fundamental building block of society, a true society in itself, and its rights are presented as preceding those of the state.
How does it establish this link?
It starts by stating that marriage is a natural right, established by God with the command to increase and multiply. This natural institution gives rise to the family.
And the family, though small, is called a true society.
Yes, a true society that is smaller and older than the state. And because it's a true society based on natural right, it has its own inherent rights and duties that are wholly independent of the Commonwealth, meaning independent of the state government in its core functions.
So the right to private property, flowing from the individual's nature, must also reside in the head of the household.
That's the argument. The right to private property, given by nature to the individual, must also belong to the man as the head of the household. The text sees the family group as, in a sense, an extension of the individual's personality and needs. And this right is all the stronger, the document argues, because the individual's responsibilities extend to providing for this family group.
What specific duty of the father requires this property right?
The Encyclical emphasizes that sacred natural law imposes a clear duty on the father to provide for his children's needs and sustenance, not just for today, but for the future. Nature itself, the document argues, prompts him to provide a properly conditioned safeguard against life's inevitable uncertainties for his children. And the most natural way to do this is by being able to acquire and pass down property as an inheritance.
So owning property and being able to pass it on is presented as essential for fulfilling basic parental duties and ensuring the family's long-term security.
It's framed as integral to the very purpose and stability of the family unit, extending across generations.
And the document uses this to draw a boundary around the state's authority over the family.
Absolutely. It contrasts the internal rule within the family paternal authority with the authority of the state. As long as paternal authority is exercised within its natural purpose, providing for the family's well-being, upbringing, security, the family has rights at least equal to the state regarding things necessary for its life and liberty. The fundamental point is that the family precedes the state. It's the original society.
This leads to a strong statement against state interference in the private life of the family.
The document is unequivocal here, calling it a great and pernicious error for the state to interfere arbitrarily in the private life of the family. Excessive state control is seen as undermining the natural authority and autonomy of the home.
Are there any circumstances where the state can intervene in family matters, according to the Encyclical?
Yes, but they are presented as limited exceptions, really intended to support or safeguard family rights, not replace or abolish them. The text says if a family is in extreme difficulty, utterly unable to help itself, maybe due to economic collapse or widespread illness, It's right for public authority to provide relief because the family is part of the state, and its distress affects the larger community.
Okay.
Also, if there are serious disturbances of mutual rights within the family, think severe neglect, abuse, serious internal conflict, the state can intervene to ensure justice is done and each member gets what's due to them.
But the key is that this intervention is protective and restorative, not the state taking over the family's role.
Precisely. The document explicitly states that in these justified interventions, the state doesn't abolish rights, but safeguards and strengthens them. It's about providing a safety net or resolving internal conflict when the family structure itself breaks down, not about the state becoming the primary caregiver or decision maker for the family.
And it puts a firm limit on how far rulers can go.
Rulers must stop here, the Encyclical declares flatly. Nature does not permit them to go further. The fundamental reason given circles back to the parent-child relationship. Parental authority cannot be absorbed by the state because children take their being from their parents and are, in a profound sense, an extension of their personality and identity.
Children enter society through the family, not directly under state control.
That's the model presented. Children enter society through the family unit and remain under the care and authority of their parents until they reach maturity and can exercise their own free will. The family is the natural medium through which individuals are brought into the broader society.
And how does this tie back to the critique of socialism again?
Well, the document argues that by proposing to set aside parental care and replace it with state care for children, as some socialist ideas suggested at the time, they violate natural justice and essentially destroy the structure of the home. The family, with its inherent rights to property and autonomy, is presented as this divinely and naturally established institution that socialism fundamentally undermines.
And the predicted consequences of abolishing private property and undermining family rights, according to this source, are severe.
The text paints a very grim picture indeed. It warns of confusion and disorder in every class, leading ultimately to a cruel and hateful slavery for citizens. It suggests that such policies would unleash widespread envy, detraction, conflict. Furthermore, it argues that eliminating the incentive of private property would cause all energy and effort to disappear, wealth to dry up. Leading ultimately to an equality of misery and degradation from which no one, regardless of their starting point, would escape.
That's a powerful condemnation, not just of the injustice, but of the practical negative outcomes for society as a whole.
It presents the defense of private property and the natural rights of the family as essential not just for individual well-being, but for the stability, prosperity, and moral health of society itself.
So the conclusion on property from this section is crystal clear. Socialist teaching advocating for common property must be rejected.
Unequivocally. Because, the document argues, it harms those it seeks to help the workers, it violates fundamental natural rights, it perverts the proper role of the state, and it disturbs peace. Anyone genuinely wanting to improve the condition of the poor, the text asserts, must start from the principle that private property must be held sacred and inviolable. This principle becomes the immovable foundation upon which the Church's proposed solutions are built solutions that try to manage the relationship between labor and capital within a framework that respects private ownership.
Okay, so having forcefully rejected the socialist approach and laid this strong defense for private property rooted in nature and the family, the encyclical then shifts to the Church's proposed path forward. And it makes a very strong assertion right up front. The problem of the condition of laborers cannot be solved without the involvement of religion and the Church.
This is absolutely central to the document. While acknowledging that state officials, employers, workers all have crucial roles to play, the encyclical is explicit that their efforts would be useless without the Church. It sees the root of the social problem as having a moral and spiritual dimension that purely secular approaches just cannot reach.
Why is the Church considered so essential here?
The text provides several reasons. It argues the Church draws from the gospel the strength needed to end the conflict between classes, or at least significantly soften its bitterness. Through its teachings, it guides the intellect, directs people's conduct. It has a long history of establishing and managing aid organizations. It urges all parties, rich and poor, employer and worker, to cooperate rather than be in perpetual conflict. And as we saw, it affirms the state's necessary role while also defining its just limits.
But the document also injects a dose of realism, acknowledging some, maybe uncomfortable truths about society and human nature, even with the Church involved.
Yes, it's definitely not a utopian vision. It insists that society must accept that total equality among people in terms of condition or possessions is simply impossible. This is due to natural, unavoidable differences in ability, skill, health, physical strength.
The document argues this inequality isn't necessarily a bad thing. That seems counterintuitive, maybe.
Well, it presents it as actually beneficial for both individuals and society as a whole. Why? Because a well-functioning society requires a diversity of skills, talents, roles. Different conditions and capacities are necessary for the whole social body to function effectively and harmoniously.
What about work and suffering? Does the encyclical suggest that suffering is something we can eliminate?
Far from it. It touches on the idea that work might have existed differently before sin, maybe as a fulfilling activity. But now, due to original sin, work is described as a painful necessity in the sweat of thy brow. Suffering itself is presented as an inescapable reality of this earthly life. The document is quite blunt, stating that anyone who promises complete freedom from suffering in this life is a great deceiver who will only lead people to even worse evils.
So the goal isn't to create a world without hardship, but to find remedies that ease the suffering experienced by laborers.
Exactly. The best and most practical approach, according to the text, is to accept the reality of work and suffering, and then seek out suitable remedies to alleviate the difficulties and hardships faced by working people.
This acceptance of natural inequality and the reality of suffering seems deliberately placed to contrast with the more utopian promises of some other ideologies of the time.
It anchors the document's proposals in a grounded, perhaps historically informed view of the human condition. It suggests that true solutions will involve navigating these realities with justice and virtue, rather than attempting to create some perfect, suffering-free world.
The encyclical then directly challenges the idea that different social classes are inherently enemies.
It calls the assumption that classes, rich employers and poor workers, are naturally hostile to each other a great mistake, asserting it's false and contrary to both truth and reason. It sees the conflict as a pathology, not the natural state.
Instead of conflict, what should the relationship be?
The text uses a compelling analogy: the human body. Just as different parts of the body have distinct functions but must work together in harmony for the good of the whole, the different classes of society need a well-balanced correlation and cooperation.
Capital needs labor, labor needs capital.
Exactly. Neither can achieve anything substantial without the other. Harmony, the document argues, brings order and beauty to society, while perpetual conflict leads only to savagery and chaos.
And the church's role in fostering this harmony.
The document asserts that Christian institutions possess a remarkable power to end this conflict and pull up its roots, offering a framework for cooperation rather than division.
How does the church accomplish this, practically speaking?
Primarily by reminding both sides of their mutual duties to one another, with a strong emphasis on those duties based on justice. This principle of rendering what is due to the other party is presented as the foundation for regulating the relationship between employers and workers.
Let's break down those duties. What are the workers' duties based on justice, according to the text?
The encyclical is quite specific. Workers have a duty to faithfully and fully carry out any free and fair labor contracts they've entered into. They must not damage the employer's property or insult their person. They're exhorted to refrain from violence and rioting when pursuing their interests, a direct response to the social unrest of the time.
Right.
And they must avoid associating with evil men, those who would mislead them with false promises and vain hopes, often leading to destructive actions.
And what about the employer's duties based on justice?
Employers have several key responsibilities outlined. They must not treat workers as slaves. This is a core point about respecting their inherent dignity as human beings. They must respect the dignity of workers as men and as Christians, implying duties related to allowing religious practice. They're obligated to provide time for workers to fulfill religious duties and protect them from corrupting influences or opportunities for sin in the workplace, acknowledging the moral environment of the factory.
Okay.
Employers also mustn't neglect their own family duties or waste their earnings on extravagance, as this has negative social consequences too. And importantly, they must not impose labor on workers that is beyond their strength or unsuitable for their age or sex.
But the document points to one employer duty as the most important, based on justice. What was that?
Yes, it states that among the primary duties of an employer, the most important one, flowing directly from justice, is to pay each person what is just. This isn't just advisable, it's a requirement of justice.
And what does the encyclical say constitutes a just wage? Does it give a number?
It doesn't give a specific number, no. The text acknowledges that many factors determine a just wage, but it provides crucial guiding principles and strong warnings. Employers must remember that both divine and human law forbid oppressing the poor for profit or profiting from another's need.
So taking advantage of desperation is unjust.
Absolutely. The document uses vivid biblical language to underscore the gravity of wage theft, stating that withholding a due wage is a grave sin that cries out to heaven, citing the Epistle of James. Furthermore, employers must not injure the savings of poor workers through force, fraud, or usury. The text highlights that the meager possessions of poor workers are particularly sacred precisely because they are so inadequate relative to their needs and represent the sum total of their security.
The document seems to suggest that simply adhering to these duties of justice on both sides would significantly improve the situation. Like, that alone would be huge.
It states that obedience to these specific rules of justice governing the employer-worker relationship would, by itself, be sufficient to dampen the force of their differences and remove the main causes of conflict. It implies that much of the current struggle stemmed from violations of these basic principles of justice.
But the Church's vision goes beyond mere justice. It introduces a higher principle.
Absolutely. The encyclical emphasizes that even perfect justice isn't enough. A higher principle is needed: charity. The Church, animated by the Spirit of Christ, urges not just fair dealings but a relationship of brotherhood and friendship between classes, seeing each other as fellow human beings, not just economic units.
And this requires looking beyond the purely material world, seeing the bigger picture.
Yes, the text argues that we cannot fully understand and value earthly goods or labor, poverty, wealth, without a clear vision of eternal life. Earthly life, it reminds us, is a place of exile, not our permanent home. From this perspective, whether one has great wealth or suffers poverty is ultimately irrelevant to eternal happiness. What truly matters is how that wealth or suffering is handled and used in this life.
Christ's example is brought in here to frame the perspective on suffering.
Yes, the document notes that Christ redeemed us, but he didn't remove suffering from our lives. Instead, he sanctified it, transforming it into a potential source of virtue and merit. The path to eternal goods, the text says, often involves following Christ's own path through suffering if we suffer with him. His suffering and example ease our own burdens, not just psychologically, but through his grace and the hope of the eternal reward he offers. It cites the idea that our light, momentary afflictions achieve for us an eternal glory.
And the rich receive specific warnings related to this eternal perspective. They don't get a pass.
Oh, definitely not. The Encyclical warns the rich that wealth doesn't exempt them from suffering and can even be a serious hindrance to achieving eternal happiness, citing Christ's words about the difficulty for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven.
The camel in the eye of the needle.
Exactly. They should tremble at Christ's threats against the wealthy. Woe to you that are rich. The text is explicit that God demands a rigorous account for how they use their wealth.
This naturally leads to a crucial distinction the Encyclical makes about wealth: the right of ownership versus the moral obligation of use.
This is a foundational point in Catholic social teaching that really stems from this document. The Encyclical reaffirms, as we've seen, that private ownership is a natural right necessary for society. However, how that wealth is used is where morality and Christian duty come in. Citing St. Thomas Aquinas and the Apostle Paul, the text argues no one should use their property only for themselves. In times of need, they are morally obligated to share their surplus with others.
Is there a limit to what must be shared? Or do you give away everything?
No, there's a limit. The document, again drawing on Aquinas, clarifies that one isn't required to give up what's needed for one's own sustenance or the needs of one's family, or what's necessary to maintain a fitting station in life appropriate to one's state, as long as it's done becomingly. No one's expected to impoverish themselves or their family.
But surplus wealth has a clear destination.
Absolutely. After one's own reasonable needs and those of their family are met, the surplus is for the poor, citing Luke 11.41, but yet that which remaineth give alms. This is presented primarily as a duty of Christian charity, not strict justice. Unless it's a case of extreme necessity for the other person, in which case justice does require assistance. But generally, it's a duty of charity, guided by Christ's teaching, not something legally enforceable. The text emphasizes that giving is more blessed, and charity shown to the poor is charity shown directly to Christ himself. Whatever you did for one of these least brothers of mine, you did for me.
The Encyclical frames those with wealth or even just talents as stewards of God's gifts, like they're managing it for him.
Yes, exactly. Anyone with abundance material wealth natural talent, spiritual gifts, is presented as a steward. These gifts are given by God to be used for one's own perfection and for the benefit of others. Those with abundance, the text states, should not be wanting in generosity, and those with skills should share them for the common good, citing St. Gregory the Great.
And the document also seeks to elevate the dignity of poverty and work in the eyes of both the poor and the rich.
It teaches clearly that poverty is not a disgrace before God. Working for one's sustenance, even hard manual labor, is not shameful. It points to Christ's own life as the ultimate example. Though divinely rich, he became poor for us. He was known as the son of a carpenter and worked as one himself.
So human worth isn't determined by wealth or social status in this view.
Not at all. The document strongly emphasizes that true human worth lies in virtue and moral character, which are equally accessible to both rich and poor. Eternal reward is gained through virtue and service to God and neighbor, regardless of one's earthly station. The text even suggests God seems to favor the unfortunate or humble. Blessed are the poor in spirit.
Right.
Christ himself invited the weary and burdened and embraced the lowly. This understanding, the Encyclical argues, should serve to humble the rich, lift the spirits of the suffering poor, narrow the gulf created by pride, and foster genuine friendship and mutual respect between different classes.
And ultimately, the deepest bond that can unite these classes is presented as charity.
Yes, Christian charity is the ultimate transformative principle. It unites them not just through justice or even earthly friendship, but because they share the same Father in God, the same ultimate goal, and have been redeemed by Christ, making them spiritual siblings to one another and to Christ himself, the firstborn amongst many brethren. They share common natural and divine gifts. This shared dignity and spiritual kinship, animated by charity, is the Church's core answer to transcending class conflict and fostering true social harmony.
So the Church's proposed path combines the strict requirements of justice duties for both employers and workers, including a just wage and humane conditions, with this transformative higher principle of Christian charity, all grounded in an eternal perspective on life, suffering, and wealth.
It offers a moral and spiritual framework, basically arguing that addressing the material conditions of labor fundamentally requires addressing the hearts and minds of the people involved, something only religion, it claims, can effectively do.
Okay, beyond teaching these principles, the document also highlights the Church's active role and practical efforts throughout history and in the present to address the condition of laborers. It's not just talk.
Yes, the Encyclical is clear that the Church doesn't just offer abstract doctrines. It has a history of concrete action for social reform and aid. It educates its members through its teachings, doctrine, and guides their lives through its structure and practices, discipline, with bishops and priests responsible for spreading these teachings effectively.
And the text calls this educational aspect the most important thing. Why?
It argues that achieving any good social outcome ultimately depends on this. The Church's means for influencing people's minds and wills, given by Christ, are presented as uniquely effective because they can reach into the deepest parts of the human soul. They can motivate people towards duty, help them control their passions like greed or envy, encourage them to love God and neighbor, and remove the internal obstacles to living a virtuous life.
The document even points to history as proof of the Church's positive impact on society.
It states that Christian doctrine fundamentally renewed society in the past, lifting humanity out of paganism, improving its condition far beyond anything known before. Christ is identified as the source of this renewal. Therefore, the text argues, if society is suffering and needs healing now, it must return to Christian life and institutions.
Leaving principles leads to ruin. Returning leads to wholeness.
That's the idea. Leaving these principles leads to ruin. Returning to them leads to wholeness. This applies not just to the state as a whole, but specifically to groups within it, like the workers.
So a spiritual and moral return is seen as the necessary foundation for fixing the current social problems.
Absolutely. It's presented as the prerequisite for any lasting or effective solution. But while the foundation is spiritual, the Church's concern is also intensely practical. The document states the Church strongly desires the poor to escape their crushing poverty and significantly improve their material condition.
How does the Church help practically, according to the Encyclical? What does it do?
Well, firstly, by encouraging virtue among its members, it helps indirectly. For instance, Christian obedience encourages connection to God and discourages excessive desire for material possessions and pleasure, which the text calls a pair of disasters that can ruin anyone, rich or poor. It explicitly quotes 1 Timothy, "Love of money is the root of all evil."
Right.
Furthermore, Christian virtue promotes living frugally, which helps the poor save money for hardships and avoid costly vices like gambling or excessive drinking that squander meager resources.
So living a virtuous life actually has tangible economic benefits for those struggling with poverty.
Yes, it enables prudence and saving. But the church also acts directly through charitable efforts and institutions. It has a long history of founding and managing organizations specifically aimed at helping the poor rise out of poverty and alleviating their suffering.
The text gives some striking historical examples of this direct action.
It does. It recalls the early Christians, noting how those with means shared generously so that no one among them was in want, distributing goods according to need. It mentions the apostles establishing deacons explicitly to manage the daily distribution of aid. It highlights St. Paul's tireless efforts traveling to collect alms for poorer Christian communities. The text even cites historical accounts describing an early Christian fund of piety, used entirely for the needy supporting the living poor, ensuring proper burial for the dead, caring for orphans, the aged, assisting anyone afflicted by misfortune.
That shows a deep commitment to practical aid right from the very beginning of the church.
It was integral to the Christian community's life. The Encyclical states that over time, the church built up a vast patrimony for the poor, managing funds and resources specifically dedicated to charitable purposes, helping the poor avoid the degradation of begging, acting as a compassionate mother to both rich and poor, using the immense stores of charity it generated. It founded numerous religious orders and countless useful institutions dedicated to charitable work hospitals, orphanages, schools, relief centers, which the text says performed their work so well that there was hardly any need that was not met with help.
Wow, but the document notes that some people at the time criticized the church for this emphasis on charity, arguing the public state-run relief program should replace it.
Yes, it addresses this contemporary critique directly and forcefully. It declares that no human expedience, no matter how well-intentioned, can replace Christian charity. Charity, the text argues, is uniquely capable of providing effective help whenever and wherever it's needed, reaching into situations and motivations that purely governmental programs cannot.
Why only the church?
It emphasizes that only the church possesses this virtue fully because its source is the very heart of Christ himself. Anyone who separates themselves from the church, the document states, is fundamentally separated from Christ and therefore far from this unique wellspring of transformative charity.
So, the church presents its charitable work, rooted in Christian doctrine and animated by Christ's Spirit, as an indispensable practical component of solving the labor question, something state programs alone can't replicate.
It's framed not just as welfare, but as an essential expression of the Christian spirit that must permeate any true and lasting solution to social problems.
Okay, we've explored the context, the critique of socialism, the defense of property, the church's spiritual and practical role. Now, the encyclical turns to outlining the proper role and limits of the government in addressing the condition of laborers.
Yes, the document explicitly states everyone must act state officials, employers, workers, but reiterates that their efforts are useless without the church. It then focuses on the state, defining its role not necessarily by specific contemporary examples, but by what reason and divine wisdom show is right, referencing earlier encyclicals on the Christian understanding of the state.
What is presented as the primary duty of rulers, then?
Their foremost duty is to serve the common good through sound laws and institutions. The administration should promote public and private well-being by fostering things like sound morals, orderly family life, respect for religion and justice, fair taxation, and the development of industry, commerce, agriculture. These actions, the document argues, generally increase the welfare and happiness for all citizens.
And these general state efforts also help the poor specifically.
Yes, the text states that through these efforts for the common good, rulers can greatly help the poor. This is presented as being fully within the state's legitimate authority and duty. They shouldn't be criticized for this kind of intervention that benefits everyone. The argument is that the more effective the government is in these fundamental areas of promoting the common good, the less need there will be for other, more specific forms of aid to the workers.
Does the document see all citizens, rich and poor, as having equal standing before the state? Is that explicit?
Yes, it strongly emphasizes that the state exists for the common good of all citizens, both high and low. Poor workers are presented as having equal rights of citizenship. They are true, living members of the state, not just some marginalized group, and in many countries they constitute the majority.
And neglecting the poor is therefore a failure of government.
The text calls it irrational, and an injustice to neglect one class of citizens. It states it's a clear duty of government to expend every solicitude for the well-being of the poorer population. Failing to do so, the Encyclical argues, is an injustice because it fails to render to each class what is due to it for the sake of the whole. It cites Aquinas again. The well-being of the parts is essential for the well-being of the whole state.
So impartial justice is a core duty of the state towards all its citizens.
Absolutely. It's presented as a primary duty of rulers to guard justice impartially for all classes.
The document also highlights the specific and vital contribution that workers make to the state, which justifies special attention to them.
Right. While acknowledging everyone contributes differently, rulers, soldiers, judges, businessmen, the text notes that a well-constituted state needs an abundance of material goods. It cites Aquinas again, saying these goods are necessary for the exercise of virtue and for a decent life.
And where do these essential goods come from? Who makes them?
They are provided, the text says, by the exceedingly effective labor of the poor workers, whether in agriculture or factories. The energy, skill, and effort of workers are so great that the document states it's right to say they make nations wealthy. They are the primary engine of material prosperity.
Because of this vital contribution, does the state have a specific duty to workers?
Yes, the Encyclical argues that justice requires the state to pay special heed to the poor workers, precisely because they provide such great benefit to society and are its vital engine. They deserve to have adequate housing, clothing, live more comfortably, and suffer less hardship than the dire poverty they were experiencing.
So efforts to improve workers' lives should be favored.
It should be favored, yes. The document stresses this isn't about unjustly taking from one class to give to another. Rather, it benefits the whole state because it's vital for the common good that those producing the necessary goods don't themselves suffer want.
But the Encyclical has been very careful to emphasize limits on state intervention, particularly regarding private property and the family. Does it reiterate those limits when discussing the state's role in the economy?
Yes, it absolutely reinforces those boundaries. It repeats that the state cannot justly absorb individuals or families. Justice demands that individuals and families retain their freedom and autonomy unless the public interest or a specific party's rights are demonstrably harmed.
Government exists for the subjects.
Exactly. Government exists for the good of the subjects it serves, not for the power or enrichment of the officials who govern. Its authority comes from God and should be exercised in a way that reflects God's benevolent care for creation.
So when is state intervention justified in matters concerning labor and property? What's the trigger?
State intervention is justified only when the public interest or the interest of a specific class is harmed or threatened, and no other effective way exists to remedy the evil or avert the danger. The text says the nature and limits of any intervention are strictly determined by the specific case and the necessity. Laws shouldn't go beyond what's strictly needed for this purpose.
Can you give us some concrete examples from the document of situations that would justify state intervention within these limits?
Sure. The text lists several types. Maintaining public peace and order is fundamental. If working conditions cause social unrest, the state can intervene. Ensuring family life isn't destroyed by working conditions like denying time for family duties or exposing workers to moral dangers would justify intervention. Respect for religion is another. If workers are denied time for religious duties, like resting on the Sabbath, the state can step in. Protecting public and private morality and justice, particularly if morals are threatened in factories due to improper mixing of sexes, long hours leading to vice, or other sinful practices. Preventing unjust burdens or conditions imposed by employers that are contrary to human dignity is a clear case. And preventing excessive work that harms health or disregards the age or sex of workers is explicitly listed.
These points sound very much like foundational arguments for modern labor protection laws. Limits on working hours, safety standards, restrictions on child labor.
They absolutely are. The Encyclical is arguing the state has a moral duty to use its authority to set minimum standards and prohibit conditions that violate justice, human dignity, and the common good, precisely because individual workers are often vulnerable and need this collective protection against potential exploitation.
How should this intervention be carried out? Carefully.
The text reiterates that the nature and limits are determined by the specific case and necessity. Laws enacted should be proportionate and not go beyond what is needed for the specific justified purpose.
Protecting rights, especially for the vulnerable, seems to be a recurring theme here.
Absolutely. The document emphasizes rights are sacred and must be protected by the government, and it makes a very specific point. This protection is especially needed for the poor and weak. The rich, it notes, often have resources and power to protect themselves and need less state help, but the vast mass of the poor depends entirely on state protection. Since workers belong to this mass, the state has a special duty to cherish and protect them.
The text highlights a couple of specific problems of the era where this state protection is particularly needed. What were they?
Yes. The first is protecting private property itself. The document argues this is essential against the greed for revolution, those using violence for what it calls unwise equality, by abolishing property. Government must curb these agitators by law, protecting workers from their bad influence and owners from plunder.
And the second specific area needing state attention.
Preventing strikes. The text identifies the usual causes: excessive hours, work too hard, pay too low. Strikes, it notes, cause great harm not just to those involved but to the public good, and often risk violence and disorder. The most powerful and effective way to deal with strikes, the document argues, is for the law to intervene in time, meaning proactively to prevent them by removing their underlying causes, resolving the conflicts based on justice.
So the state shouldn't just break strikes by force, but should address the conditions that lead to them in the first place.
Exactly. It's a call for proactive governmental action based on justice, ensuring fair conditions and wages to prevent the eruption of labor conflict, which is seen as harmful to everyone.
The document also goes into detail about protecting working conditions themselves, building on this general principle of dignity and justice.
It does, and it firmly roots these protections in recognizing that earthly life isn't the final goal, but a means to spiritual perfection. Human dignity is presented as equal regardless of wealth or status because all belong to the same God, called to the same eternal destiny. Therefore, the Encyclical argues no one can justly agree to treatment incompatible with their dignity or that hinders their path to perfection, their duties to God and self.
This implies a right to sufficient rest, including for religious purposes, right?
Yes. The document states necessary rest, particularly on holy days, isn't for idleness, but for fulfilling religious duties, freeing people from routine labor to reflect on heaven, worship God, renew their spirit. It explicitly links this to the Sabbath purpose, citing the commandment, remember the Sabbath day, and God's rest after creation.
And what about protecting physical health and limits? How practical does it get?
It gets very clear and practical here. Justice and humanity, it says, forbid crushing workers with excessive labor that dulls their reason or exhausts their strength. Human capacity is limited. It needs rest, refreshment. A day's work must not exceed this strength.
And the amount of rest depends.
Depends on the work type, conditions, worker health. It specifically calls for shorter hours for hard or unhealthy work, like mining. Seasons should be considered. And it's presented as fundamentally unjust to demand from women and children the work suitable only for strong men.
There's a specific concern for children in the workplace mentioned.
A strong one. The document stresses children shouldn't be in factories or workshops until mature enough, physically and mentally. Premature labor, it warns, risks stunting their development, body, mind, character, and deprives them of education. Certain work is also deemed less suitable for women who have primary domestic duties that protect female virtue and family welfare, which the Encyclical considers paramount.
So the general rule for working hours and rest is tied to the nature of the work, conditions, and the worker's capacity, age, sex.
Precisely. The general rule: more arduous labor, more refreshment needed. This need for rest is seen as implicitly part of any just labor contract. It's unjust to agree to terms requiring neglect of duties to God or self due to exhaustion.
The Encyclical touches on wages again here, linking it to these basic conditions. How does it frame that?
Yes, it reiterates the critical importance of a just wage. It directly confronts the argument, prevalent then, that a wage is just simply because a worker freely agrees to it, regardless of the amount. The text argues this view is incomplete. It misses a fundamental aspect. Work isn't just a commodity. It's the necessary means by which a person sustains their very life.
Work is both personal and necessary for survival. That's the distinction.
Exactly. Its personal energy, skill belong to the worker. It's necessary. Natural law dictates you need the fruits of labor to live and provide. While a worker might personally be free to accept any wage in desperation, the necessity of that work for survival means, from a justice standpoint, the wage must be sufficient for a frugal, well-behaved worker to meet basic needs for himself and his family.
And if the wage is not sufficient, if someone is forced to take less,
the text states clearly that if a worker is forced to accept a cruelly low wage due to dire necessity and fear of worse misfortune like starvation or homelessness, He is the victim of violence to which justice cries out. His nominal freedom to contract is undermined by the unjust pressure of his circumstances.
So the state's proper role includes ensuring working conditions and wages meet these basic standards of justice and human dignity, intervening when necessary to protect the vulnerable worker from exploitation within those limits discussed earlier.
Yes, the document suggests that while associations might be effective in many cases, the state has the ultimate responsibility. It's the necessary recourse when fundamental rights are violated or significant harm is done and other remedies fail.
The Encyclical also suggests that a just wage is important because it allows workers to improve their condition over time, specifically by acquiring property.
It strongly advocates for this. It argues that if a worker receives a wage truly sufficient not just to survive, but to comfortably meet his needs and his family's, he'll find it easier to save. And if he's prudent, avoids wasteful spending, he can gradually accumulate some property.
And this brings the document right back to the crucial importance of private property.
It does. It reiterates that effective, peaceful solutions to the social chaos must begin with the principle that the right to private property must be absolutely defended. Therefore, laws should support this right and, importantly, actively work to help as many people as possible among the working class to actually acquire property.
What are the benefits envisioned if more working people can acquire property like a home or a small plot of land?
The document lists several significant benefits. Firstly, a more just distribution of wealth. The text describes the current state as split by a huge gap. Powerful rich controlling everything. Powerless poor filled with bitterness, ready to revolt. If people are motivated by the hope of acquiring property, especially land, the Encyclical suggests this will gradually help bring the classes closer and narrow that dangerous gap between extreme wealth and pervasive poverty.
That's a clear social benefit, reducing class tension and inequality.
Yes. A second benefit mentioned is increased abundance of earthly goods, national wealth. People working land they own, the text argues, do so with far greater willingness and diligence than those working for others. They develop a genuine love for the soil, providing for them and their families. This increased effort, care, and affection can significantly boost agricultural production and overall national wealth.
And a third benefit relates to social stability. People staying put.
Yes, the document suggests people will naturally prefer to stay in their own country where they were born and raised, less likely to emigrate if they see a path to improving their lives and securing their future through acquiring property at home. This implies a benefit for national stability, retaining valuable population and labor.
But for these benefits to be fully realized, the document mentions a condition regarding the state's fiscal power. What was that?
Yes, it states that individual efforts to acquire property through hard work and saving must not be exhausted by excessive taxation. Since the right to private property is based on natural law preceding human law, the state, cannot justly abolish it. While the government can regulate the use of property for the common good, like zoning laws, levying taxes that are excessive, more than reasonable for the common good, is described as violating natural justice and humanity because it hinders the ability to acquire and retain property.
So reasonable taxation for the common good is okay, but excessive taxation preventing property accumulation by workers is unjust.
That is the distinction made. The state's fiscal policy should support, not undermine, the ability of individuals, especially workers, to acquire property.
Finally, the Encyclical turns to the power and importance of associations, particularly workers' unions. This seems like a key part of the solution offered.
Yes, the document concludes by discussing the vital role of voluntary organizations. It states employers and workers can achieve much good through institutions that help the poor and bridge the class gap. Examples given include mutual aid societies, various charities, foundations for worker security accident, sickness, old age funds.
But workers' unions are highlighted as especially important and relevant in this modern industrial era.
The document notes unions are increasingly common, a necessary response to modern needs. It finds their formation, whether solely workers or both classes together, encouraging, and expresses a strong desire for them to grow in number and effectiveness.
The text describes these associations as sui juris, meaning they have their own inherent right to exist and govern themselves.
Yes, it explicitly recognizes the human drive to associate as a fundamental natural impulse, citing biblical wisdom, Ecclesiastes on companionship, Proverbs on brotherhood. Beside the state, general society for common good, humans naturally join smaller private societies for specific private ends, like business partnerships or these worker associations.
And the state cannot justly forbid these private associations.
The document argues this forcefully. The state cannot forbid them because the right to form them comes directly from natural law itself, which precedes the state. The state's purpose is to defend natural rights, not destroy them. Forbidding voluntary associations, the text says, is like the state fighting against itself, since both state and private associations stem from the same principle. Humans are social beings who can associate.
Are there any circumstances where the state can intervene with associations, like with families?
Yes, similar limits apply. The state can intervene if an association pursues aims contrary to honesty, justice, or legitimate state interests, the common good. In such cases, government can justly prevent formation or dissolve existing groups. However, there's a crucial caution. The state must be very careful not to strip citizens' rights or pass unfair laws under the mere pretext of public interest. Laws regulating associations must conform to reason and God's eternal law.
The Encyclical also includes religious associations in this discussion of the right to associate.
It does, listing various religious communities, societies, orders as examples of associations based on natural right for good, virtuous purposes. In purely religious matters, they're accountable only to the church. The state, it argues, has no right to interfere in their internal religious life, but should actively defend and help them.
And it criticizes states that don't do that.
It strongly criticizes states that unjustly attacked religious associations by subjecting them to excessive civil law, denying corporate status, hindering property ownership, or seizing property. It calls such actions unjust and harmful. It also notes the hypocrisy of governments tolerating harmful associations while suppressing peaceful Christian ones.
So the argument is the state should defend the autonomy of legitimate associations, both religious and civil, including workers' unions, as long as they operate justly.
Exactly. They're seen as a natural, beneficial expression of human social nature that the state should protect and support, not control or suppress, provided they pursue just and moral ends.
The text expresses some concerns about the nature of some existing unions at the time it was written, though.
It notes many unions were controlled by secret leaders pursuing questionable or harmful ends, and they pressured non-members to join. This presented a dilemma for Christian workers. Join potentially risky unions endangering faith or pushing injustice, or find another way. The document states forming their own unions based on sound principles is the right choice to avoid great danger to religion.
And it offers specific praise for Catholic efforts to form unions.
Yes, it speaks highly of Catholics actively forming unions, gathering information, studying needs, learning from experience to help the poor, striving to raise wages, bring justice, promote duty, and the gospel among workers. It mentions notable individuals and clergy supporting guiding these efforts, and wealthy Catholics contributing funds for mutual aid, fraternal societies, or security for members, accident, sickness, old age.
These Catholic-led efforts are seen as beneficial.
The document states these diverse efforts have already helped social affairs greatly, giving hope for the future, provided the unions grow and are wisely, virtuously led.
And how should the state interact with these unions, especially the well-ordered ones? Should it leave them alone?
It should protect them and their rights, but not interfere in their internal life or management. Their vital spirit, the text argues, comes from within, from the voluntary commitment and shared goals. External force or excessive state control can easily destroy this internal life and effectiveness.
How should these unions be organized according to the document's guidance? What makes a good union structure?
They must have harmonious organization, careful administration to be effective. Members have the natural right to choose their structure and rules freely to achieve their goals.
Is there a guiding principle for their organization?
Yes, the general rule given is that their structure and administration must allow for smooth action, aiming to provide members with the maximum possible physical and spiritual well-being and the opportunity for property ownership.
And what should be the absolute paramount aim of these workers' associations, the top priority?
The document is crystal clear and firm on this. Improving faith and morals must be the chief and primary aim. Otherwise, the encyclical warns, unions will inevitably decline, become just like those neglecting religion entirely. It echoes Christ's stark question, what does it profit a man if he gain the whole world but suffer the loss of his soul?
The spiritual end takes precedence over the material.
Absolutely. It cites Matthew. Seek ye therefore first the kingdom of God and his justice, and all these things shall be added unto you.
So even for a workers' union focused on material conditions, the spiritual and moral well-being of its members must be the top priority.
That's the model. The text lists specific religious duties integral to these Christian unions: providing religious instruction, instilling duty to God, belief, hope, salvation, guarding against error, bad influences, encouraging worship, religious practice, holy days, sacraments, fostering respect, love for the church.
And what practical functions flow from this spiritually grounded organization? What do they actually do?
The document lists functions common to mutual aid societies and unions: fostering harmony, peace among members, arranging office duties for common good, careful fund management, providing aid for needs, accident, sickness, old age, creating mechanisms to harmonize employer-worker rights, maybe a dispute committee, even providing work opportunities and emergency funds.
These sound like the practical benefits members seek from unions, but presented here as flowing from a foundation of faith and morals.
They are. The document argues Catholic unions, by grounding work in Christian principles, prioritizing spiritual well-being, can be uniquely effective in serving the poor and helping the state achieve social harmony. It recalls early Christians who, despite poverty persecution, had profound virtue, earned respect, spread truth simply by living their faith.
And this historical example is presented as relevant for addressing the modern labor issue today.
Yes, the text concludes this section stating the complex labor issue needs addressing. Christian workers, through unions guided by wise leaders and Christian principles, can effectively solve it, following history's example, benefiting themselves and society. It expresses hope, goodwill, and justice, animated by truth, will overcome prejudice, greed.
And it offers these Catholic unions as a refuge.
Specifically offers them as hope and refuge for estranged workers, those neglecting faith, deluded by false hopes, feeling treated inhumanely by greedy employers, finding no true charity in other strife-torn unions. Catholic unions, it suggests, can invite them in, help solve material problems, receive them with faith, help, comfort.
It's a clear call to action for Catholic workers and organizations to take a leading role in forming labor associations based on these specific Christian principles: justice, charity, spiritual priority.
It's presented as a vital mechanism for achieving justice and fostering charity in the workplace and society, guided and supported by the Church's overarching mission.
So summarizing the core message of Rerum Novarum as we've just unpacked it, this document lays out a vision where resolving the urgent condition of the laborers isn't simple. It requires dedicated, coordinated efforts from the state, employers, workers. But the Encyclical places this fundamental emphasis on the indispensable role of religion and the Church.
Right. It argues the deepest roots of the problem aren't purely economic or political, but moral and religious. Therefore, any lasting solution must begin with a renewal of Christian morality and a widespread commitment to practicing charity among all members of society.
The state definitely has a necessary role, but it's specific and limited.
Yes, its role is rooted in justice and the common good. It must protect the rights of all, with a special duty to the poor and weak because they're most vulnerable. This involves preventing exploitation through just laws, working conditions, rest, child female labor, ensuring a just wage when free contract isn't enough due to necessity. It also has a duty to maintain peace by addressing the underlying causes of conflict.
Employers have clear duties based on justice, paying that just wage, respecting worker dignity, providing humane conditions.
And they have duties based on that higher principle of charity, seeing themselves as stewards of wealth, obligated to share their surplus with the needy, not just as an option, but as a moral imperative.
And workers have duties too, fulfilling contracts, avoiding violence, resisting harmful ideologies. And they are strongly encouraged, even exhorted, to form their own associations or unions for mutual aid and protection.
Crucially, these associations must have improving faith and morals as their chief aim, integrating religious practice and teaching into their very structure, ensuring material goals are pursued within a framework of spiritual well-being.
And binding all of this together, giving it life and efficacy, is that higher principle of Christian charity.
The virtue that goes beyond mere justice, fostering brotherhood, mutual respect, active care between classes, seeing each person as a fellow human created and redeemed by God.
The document concludes by reiterating the need for the Church to have freedom to carry out its mission, highlighting the essential, tireless work of clergy in teaching and guiding, and above all, pointing to the widespread practice of Christian charity by everyone as the key means to achieve the desired outcomes of peace and justice.
It's a powerful final argument circling back to the belief that solving the profound material and social problems of the era ultimately requires a spiritual and moral transformation of individuals and society guided by the Church.
Okay, here's the final provocative thought for you to consider, drawing directly from the source we've just explored in depth. Given Pope Leo XIII's fundamental argument that the solution to the conflicts between capital and labor and improving the condition of laborers ultimately depends on a renewal of Christian morals and the widespread practice of charity. Well, how might that perspective challenge or inform the way social and economic issues are approached and debated in the world today, especially in societies where religious influence in public life is often, intentionally minimized or seen as totally separate from economic discussion, something to mull over as you reflect on the document's arguments?
It certainly raises the question of whether purely secular frameworks, focused solely on legal or economic mechanisms, can truly address the complex human and moral dimensions of these enduring issues.
That's all for this deep dive into Rerum Novarum. We hope unpacking this significant document has provided you with valuable insights and a clearer understanding of its arguments.
Thank you for joining us.